Hello, I'm Night Novel, your humble storyteller for this evening. Welcome back to 𝐏𝐴𝐿 𝐿𝐼, where we are delving right into a dark and difficult situation down in the mausoleum. We're in a flashback where we're seeing Isaiah run after 𝐏𝐚. Whether or not she's truly down here is unclear. Soon, he emerged into the decrepit corridor. There was still no sign of 𝐏𝐚, only the long, ominous shapes of caskets buried in the walls and standing along the hallway, like silent sentinels resting in the dark. Though the ceilings were higher than he expected, he still felt his chest suddenly tighten, forcing his breaths to grow shallow.
𝐏𝐚?
Her name emerged from Isaiah's lips as little more than a weak, fearful whisper. As the sound of his own voice sank into his head, a bitter bile swiftly rose to the back of his throat. What a pathetic coward he was, unable to call out for his own daughter, petrified by his baseless phobia.
𝐏𝐚! 𝐏𝐚! Can you hear me?
When he forced himself to shout, however, instead of carrying any farther, his voice seemed to die out within a moment. It was as if something had smothered it. Something beyond the underground walls that surrounded him. Even if he were to scream, the sound would surely be suffocated before it could echo any further. The unnatural acoustics were only a product of his fear. More importantly, if 𝐏𝐚 was here, he had to find her. Quickly, now, before she wandered any deeper into the labyrinth. Okay. My theory is that Isaiah's being led here by a spirit that's trying to... 𝐏𝐚's not here. Maybe there wasn't even a fight with 𝐏𝐚. She never talked about this fight when we asked her about the disappearance. Was that all fabricated, just like in our dream? Is this where Isaiah's life ends? With a lamp in one outstretched hand and 𝐏𝐚's stuffed animal tucked beneath his arm, Isaiah began to wind his way through the corridors. In one of his pockets, he had the withered remnants of several flowers 𝐏𝐚 had given him not long ago. Silly as it was, he preferred to keep them on his person instead of putting them in a vase. Now, however, it was necessary to use them for another purpose. Whenever he was about to round another corner, he dropped a small colored petal at the edge. It would be enough to help him find his way back, most likely. Good thinking. No, I don't like that.
𝐏𝐚? 𝐏𝐚, I'm not cross with you. Come out and we'll act as if none of this had ever happened.
As he called out for her again, forcing himself to sound calm and dryly patient, his eyes fell on a statue across the hall. He had already passed an unsettling amount of them, but their tall, shrouded figures never ceased to disturb him.
I'll make a pot of your favorite tea and we'll read together by the fire. That's your favorite way to spend a cold night, isn't it? Far better than huddling in the dark, in the cold.
The smile that weakly threaded across his lips felt wrong, like a coffin opened from the inside. Something that never should have happened. Oh, that's, I like the language in this. It's so dark and grim and I'm enjoying it so much. Something that could have been avoided. No, he hadn't done anything wrong.
𝐏𝐚, 𝐏𝐚, please.
Another corner. Another long, empty corridor that stretched out before him, same as all the others. Was she even here? Should he turn back? What if he left, not knowing she was just around the next corner? No, the door was open. She had to be in here. He knew she was. He knew it.
Don't treat your father like this. If you want me to apologize, I will, I promise. But don't run away from me.
The strength in his voice slowly crumbled, returning to the same trembling whisper as before. Bitter and self-pitying, yet still pleading, clinging to the arrogant faith that he deserved to get his daughter back. But he did, didn't he? Hadn't he done everything for her? Given everything for her? How could she just disappear? Leave him, her father, alone and lost, searching in vain, panicking and hopeless. Then, he glimpsed it. A disturbance in the dust, the shadow of a footprint. His heart leapt. It had to be hers. Another and another, leading down the corridor, around another corner. He had to follow. He ran. The pounding in his chest threatened to stop his heart altogether, so intense that it overwhelmed him with dizziness and fresh nausea. But if she was here, and she was here, he had to find her. They had to escape. But it wasn't safe. Something about it was wrong. He could feel it, eating away at his head, into his head. Waiting, watching, staring, lurching, moving, following, hunting, closing in, closer, closer, closer. Running in circles, following his own footsteps, faster, closer, finally found. There, around the next corner. They were there. Their faces, oh, their faces. He knew it. He knew it. He knew it. He had to run. It wasn't her. It never was her. It was always them. Run. He had to run. Run. But no matter how much he ran, they were always right there. And when he stared at them, their voices entered his head.
Peel off your skin. Drill inside your skull. Drag out your intestines.
A pure, terrified hatred and rejection of everything, of himself. He couldn't leave. There was no exit. There never were any petals. Never any footprints. Too late. They were crawling in his ears, eating into his head, grinding it all up. Living inside him, pulling him down into a casket, shutting the lid. Down, 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 down.
Rot. Decay.
You ended it. Isaiah? A loud, choked gasp tore from her throat. She jerked upright, panting and coughing as sweat dripped off her forehead and into her eyes. A dream. No, another nightmare. but she couldn't remember it. That's also what I've been wondering, like, we keep having these flashbacks to Isaiah when she's sleeping, but it seems like she never remembers. So, that's... it means we know nothing of the horror that awaits us within. What on earth had she seen? I'm actually a little off-put. I'm sorry, like, I wanted to read these novels to, like, bring some comfort to you and to have fun myself, but that was just... Oh my... It's gonna be okay, okay? Actually, I can't promise you that. But, okay. It was horrible. So horrible. And yet, it had completely vanished from her mind, leaving behind no trace except her frantically racing heartbeat. To her surprise, the spot beside her on the bed was empty. It was still dark, so why had 𝐚 left? Then, as she stared numbly at the white sheets, she realized she could hear something. The soft pattering of rain. She hadn't awoken in the middle of the night. It was just a dark, gloomy morning. Pulling herself to the side of the bed, Esther shifted to stand on her feet. When her legs suddenly started to give way, she managed to grab the bedpost to steady herself just in time. A dull, numbing sensation spread along her spine, slowly draining the energy from her surrounding muscles as it traveled further downward. It was painfully familiar. The same reaction she'd felt so many times before, on dark days where she tried to drag herself upright after awakening. But since she'd been staying at the manor, she hadn't experienced it again fully. Until today. Esther drew in a deep, unsteady breath. She could do it. Even while acutely aware of her own weakness, the feeling of being a severed puppet, she could still force herself to move. Gingerly, carefully, trying to suppress her fear of falling at any moment. Moving around the bed's perimeter, holding onto the edge with one hand, Esther slowly staggered over to her folded clothes. The crippling numbness gradually became less noticeable as she dressed herself, her subconscious mind adjusting to the nearly dead weight of each limb. Part of her was begging to lie back down, to try and sleep off the debilitation. She wanted to stay awake, to go on and greet 𝐚, face the day to make progress with Isaiah's research. Anything, no matter how small, was better than surrendering completely. After steadying herself for a few minutes, Esther made her way down the stairs, adjusting to the weight a little more with every step. She could see 𝐚's small figure seated in the chair before the fire, holding a mug of tea in her hands. When she noticed Esther, 𝐚 blinked, her eyes drifting away rather suddenly. She took a long sip of her tea before lowering the cup with a faint smile on her lips. It seemed different somehow, thin, uncertain. "Hello, Esther. I woke up early today and couldn't get back to sleep. I've already been doing things around the house for a little bit. Since it's raining, I'm going to clean the parlor and the rooms at the back of the manor I don't use much. You can go ahead and spend the day with Papa's research if you like." I already had breakfast, but I left some for you in the kitchen.
There was something unusually strained about Seyna's voice, as if the casual brightness of her words was forced, an attempted show instead of her normal easy warmth.
Well then, I'm going to start with one of the old storage rooms, I think. I'll see you later,
Finishing the rest of her tea in a gulp, she set her empty cup on the end table, swiftly rising to her feet.
Yes. Thank you for the meal. It's all right. If you want anything else before dinner, there's plenty in the pantry. Good luck with the research.
After a brief pause, she turned to hurry off towards the stairs, her swift footfalls echoing through the foyer. Her absence left Esther with a twisted knot in her gut, a sudden, almost nauseated fear that she'd done something horribly wrong. But how? Seyna had been acting perfectly fine the previous night, even curling up tightly against her for comfort. She didn't seem sick and hadn't mentioned a headache, so it seemed unlikely for pain to be the cause of it. Is she trying to, not mention the mausoleum? Because we did say, let's go to the mausoleum, it's gonna be so much fun. Is she just trying to, push all of that away? Is that why she's acting like this? Perhaps she was just in a bad mood. Not everybody could be happy and warm for every moment of their waking lives. There was no use in overthinking it now, especially since it was probably nothing. It only unnerved her because of the resemblance to their previous dream. That was all. That was all. After forcing her tightened stomach to eat some of the food Seyna prepared for her, Esther returned to Isaiah's study. But as she reached for the door, she noticed it was fully shut. Had she left it that way yesterday? Oh, don't say that. She couldn't remember much, not beyond the dizzy spell that had overtaken her. Once she'd slipped inside the study, Esther lit a few candles to relieve the gray gloom, shivering a little from the cold. The study didn't feel particularly unsettling or eerie to her anymore. Instead, it brought her a strange sense of comfort, as a place she could connect with somehow. Picking up the remaining books and papers from the shelf she'd started yesterday, Esther sat down at Isaiah's desk and pulled over a candle. Despite the heavy lethargy weighing down her body, she was still determined to get through at least a little bit of reading today. Even if her efforts were ultimately fruitless, it was better than doing nothing. As she picked up one of the books, a long rolled-up piece of paper stuck beneath it suddenly fluttered onto her lap. Once she'd smoothed it out across the desk, Esther saw the familiar scribble of Isaiah's handwriting, though the piece seemed a little neater, more formal. He'd even titled it, albeit haphazardly at the top of the page, Preliminary Findings on God Spirits. It is interesting that we're finding these in a pretty chronological order, right? What are the chances of that? Propping her chin up on one hand, she leaned forward in her chair and began to read. Note to Jeremiah. Kindly read over these pages and tell me quite honestly if I sound like a madman. I certainly feel like one. I penned it half in jest, thinking I might turn it into an abstract for an academy publication, before remembering that I'd told the head he was a sniveling little bureaucrat with the mental facilities of a mosquito. Still, old habits remain difficult to shake.
Perhaps you might publish it under your name if you think any of it may hold water. At the very least, you might make some of the rusty old codgers' hearts give out from the mention of anything remotely metaphysical. Dashes. Preliminary findings on god spirits. A treatise on the Iraphel and the pale cachexia. Oh yeah, spill the beans. Come on, spill the beans, Isaiah, all over me. Over the course of several years of research, I've discovered a remarkable amount of literature on the universal presence of god spirits, entities lesser known as the Iraphel. In essence, they are a formless energy, one that can travel from a human's surroundings into their physical body. What attracts them the most is the power of strong emotion. The waves of energy released by feelings such as despair, frustration, anger, and of course, love. However, when they enter a host, they will begin to consume all of their energy, numbing their bodily strength as well as the intensity of their emotions. Still, as tempting as it remains to simplify and generalize them, the Iraphel do not appear to be creatures of evil. It seems more accurate to describe them as forces of nature, following a primeval impulse to survive at any cost. They feed off the energy of consciousness itself, leeching from both the impulses of the nervous system and the soul's connection to the universe. The informal title of god spirits comes from the fact that they are simply too overpowering for the current human mind. To coexist with them, it would require a divine level of inexhaustible strength. As for their existence in the worlds, for the vast majority of cases, they are completely invisible to the eye. From my research, it seems likely that almost every human unknowingly carries at least several of these spirits within them, but displaces their draining effects under different names. Curiously enough, the act of becoming overly conscious of this foreign presence seemed to attract further Iraphel to the host. There appears to be no limit to the amount that can infect a body. Indeed, the more that dwell within a person, the more spirits are drawn to them in a slow, steady loop. However, there have been several strange cases of the complete opposite occurring. A pure vessel, hitherto untouched by the spirit's invasions, can suddenly become highly susceptible to them within a very short time period. Extreme stress and powerful emotion may act like a magnet for the Iraphel, drawing them in, if present, from the surrounding individuals and environment like an immense vortex. This may also occur with those already possessed, though it is even less common for these spirits rarely congregate in large numbers. But the most interesting facet of these spirits is their potential connection to a common, incurable disease, that which is known as the pale cachexia. If the Iraphel do in fact exist, their possible relation to the pale is one that cannot be ignored. Indeed, if one connected earlier writings on the god spirits with the instances of those who have recovered from the pale, one could glean the true nature of a possible cure. With that said, the only potential cures one could surmise are disheartening to say the least. One is virtually impossible, and the other impossibly cruel. I will discuss these methods in an attempt to learn how they might be potentially achieved, but attempting either of them with our cured knowledge of the Iraphel would be thoroughly foolish. The crueler method is the more feasible of the two, but it would ultimately require Go on. Esther quickly turned the paper over, her heart skipping a beat. It was empty. No continuation at all. But in his preface at the top, Isaiah had mentioned multiple pages. The others were close by then, surely. Scattering her pile of books across the desk, she searched through them with intense, increasingly anxious focus. It had to be here somewhere. It had to be. But even after she combed through every book, went through every pile, and even ran back over to the bookshelf to search through it, she found nothing. "I can't believe it," she muttered to herself, so stunned and crestfallen that the words came from her without thought. The raffle. Esther still found it nearly impossible to believe they existed. But if they did, then Isaiah had to be on the right track. Even if he sounded skeptical of the potential cures, they might hint at something she could pursue further. It was, without a doubt, the very best lead she'd found so far. Why then did her luck have to suddenly run out like this? Damn it! It's here. I know it is. Clenching her jaw, she began to comb her way through the entire row of shelves, pulling out every stray piece of paper she laid eyes on. It felt like fate was taunting Esther, dangling the key to her condition in front of her face before hiding it away again. The missing pages were simply too much of a cruel coincidence. Why, oh why, were these papers the only ones she couldn't find? Eventually, after what seemed like hours of fruitless searching, Esther fell back on the dusty bed in defeat. The frustration from such valuable information slipping through her fingers was all but soul-crushing. There was a chance it could still be here, or somewhere else in the house. And a fresh wave of exhaustion crashed down upon her, sapping away any remaining strength she had to go hunting for it. Curling up into a little ball, she closed her eyes, listening to the drone of rainfall as the storm carried steadily on. An endless storm so heavy it seemed like it might wash everything away. She wished it would. She wished she could wake up to a new morning, to Seina's happy greeting, to a productive day in the garden and research in the study. If only sleep could bring something new, something different, something better. Something beyond a brief reprieve from the everyday burdens, the problems that were always still there whenever she woke up. But it never could. Smiling grimly at her own foolish thoughts, she sank into the arms of a long and restless slumber. Oh no, I don't want it. What now? A quiet, steady knocking stirred Esther awake. Hours must have passed. A much heavier darkness had replaced the overcast gloom from earlier. She slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed, rubbing her blurry eyes with a hand. If anything, the uneasy rest had only made her more tired.
Esther? Are you in there?
Yes. You can come in, Seina. After a moment, the door slowly creaked open. Seina stepped into view with obvious hesitation, as if she were afraid of what she might find inside.
Esther? Are you all right?
She nodded.
Have you eaten anything since this morning?
No. I haven't been hungry.
Well, there's some dinner left over in the kitchen if you'd like it. later?
Thank you. Her reply faded into a long, uncomfortable pause that seemed to stretch on and on. In reality, the silence only lasted a few seconds, but it was crushing enough to drive Esther past her typical avoidance of confrontation. Have I upset you somehow? You've been acting differently today.
No, you haven't done anything. I'm sorry if I made you feel like that. I've just been thinking about a lot today.
The initial relief she felt from Sejna's reassurance soon faded into uncertainty. Even if she had done something wrong, Sejna might be too afraid of hurting her feelings to tell her directly.
Esther, do you mind if we take a walk outside? It feels like a long time since I've really seen the moon and stars.
Of course. Let's go. Sejna smiled at her faintly, but it seemed just as strained as it did that morning, if not more so. Oh boy. A stronger sense of anxiety began to gnaw at her stomach, even as she followed the smaller girl outside, trying to reassure herself that she really hadn't done anything wrong. Esther couldn't escape the uneasy thoughts seeping into her head. Oh. With the cold night air settling on their skin, they slowly made their way across the manor grounds. The silence had a deafening quality to it, far different from even the quiet shyness of their first meeting. It was as if Sejna no longer knew what to say to her. A vast distance had opened up between them, so inexplicable and one-sided that it left Esther horribly confused. Was she in another dream? Or had her earlier dream crossed over into reality? Or, more likely, perhaps her dream only reflected the reality that had been there all along. Oh, let's just go wandering. Oh, whoops, we're in the graveyard. Oh, by the spooky mausoleum. Who'd have thought? In the midst of their quiet walk, they wandered into the cemetery through the maze of scattered graves. Sejna seemed to be heading towards the pond by the mausoleum, her slow footsteps forming a path through the long, sinister shadows cast by the headstones. Being here at night unnerved Esther by itself, and with Sejna remaining so eerily silent, it made her heart start to race even faster. As impossible and nonsensical as it was, it felt like a third presence was right behind them. Right behind them. Or all around them. Unable to contain her reflexes, she threw a swift glance over her shoulder. But there was nothing her eyes could see. Oh, that is very particularly worded, Mr. Narrator. You're not saying there's nothing there. You're saying there's nothing there her eyes could see. Noticing her anxious behavior, Sejna gave Esther a look of confusion. In response, Esther quickly lowered her gaze. It almost felt like she was going insane, blurring dreams and reality, sensing odd presences, falling into pieces at the first hint of Sejna's displeasure. Fears that she couldn't even share with her friend, because Esther was afraid of her judgment too. Even more than it frightened her, the thought filled her with a deep sadness. Oh. I know I'm mostly grumbling now, but Before long, the cold grey stone of the mausoleum was towering over them. But as they approached the pond beside it, 𝐏𝐚𝐜 slowed to a halt. Esther paused beside her, wondering why they had stopped.
Could we stay here for a little while? Or at least, I think I'll stay. If it's too cold for you, you can always head back to the fireplace.
I'm fine.
That's good. I wish I'd brought a blanket for the grass now.
Sighing softly, she lowered herself down onto the ground, the hem of her dress spilling over to lightly touch the pond's surface. After a brief pause, Esther followed suit, pulling her own skirt in close to her legs. Another long stretch of silence clouded them. Esther felt acutely aware of the cold, wet grass beneath her, bringing a sharp chill to her bones as her skirt absorbed it. Unable to bring her gaze over towards 𝐏𝐚𝐜, she watched the stray leaves drifting aimlessly across the water, graced by only faint traces of moonlight.
I've been thinking about Papa a lot lately. The way he was in the weeks before he died.
At last, 𝐏𝐚𝐜's quiet voice rose through the darkness. Devoid of their usual energy, her words were barely above a whisper, slow and monotone.
Even though he'd always had the pail, he'd fought against it so hard all the time. He worked all day long in the gardens, forced himself to eat when he grew too thin, and he always rose at dawn, even when his constant nightmares kept him awake. And he took care of me all the while, always doing so many things for me.
A pained, resigned longing filled her voice, devoid of any trace of hope. When Esther finally turned to face her, 𝐏𝐚𝐜 was gazing far off in the distance, past the pond and into the thick, unending darkness that lay beyond. Her first instinct was to try and comfort the other girl, but at the same time, she had the sense that 𝐏𝐚𝐜 wanted to keep speaking. This was the first time she'd ever addressed her father's death with someone, and perhaps the first time she'd processed it fully.
Those last few weeks, when he suddenly started changing, they were so awful, I don't even want to remember them. Papa's face had this horrible, hollow look, like there wasn't even a soul inside his body anymore. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't even come out of his locked room, no matter how much I cried and begged him to.
Curling her knees up to her chest, she rocked slowly back and forth, still staring blankly into the darkness.
The only time I saw Papa come out was late at night. He thought I'd gone to sleep, and I was waiting in the hallway like every night for any chance to see him again. But now, I almost wish I hadn't seen him.
Though her gaze finally drifted over to Esther, 𝐏𝐚𝐜 almost seemed to be looking right through her. She was somewhere else, far, far away, deep inside the recesses of her own memory.
I watched him run downstairs, desperately checking the locks on all the doors, barricading them, covering up the windows. He was mumbling under his breath, wild things about being hunted by shadows, things that were going to kill him. It felt like I was watching him go mad.
If they truly did exist, could it have been the Araphel that drove Isaiah into madness? It seemed possible, and yet something struck Esther about it as odd. Isaiah had described the increase of spirits in a host as slow and steady, not something so sudden. But why? Why do you think he changed so quickly? An expression Esther had never witnessed on 𝐶𝐚𝐴 before suddenly crossed her features, darkening them. Just before his health started to get worse, we had an argument. It was the only time I ever shouted at Papa. I was so angry back then. But after I calmed down and I realized what I'd done, I really just wanted to die. I felt like he was so disappointed in me, his troublesome, ungrateful daughter. I didn't respect his wishes. I didn't understand that he was only trying to protect me. All I did was make him feel alone again, right until the moment he died. No tears formed in her eyes. Perhaps she had already wept too many times over it, or else her grief went beyond any outward expression. She simply kept hugging her knees against her chest, staring into Esther without seeing her. She wanted so very, very desperately to comfort her friend, to reach out and pull 𝐶𝐚𝐴 into a hug, giving her the reassurance that she'd never had since Isaiah's death. But Esther felt frozen in place. There was a depth to 𝐶𝐚𝐴's sorrow that she would never understand. Perhaps that was why the other girl had suddenly grown so cold towards her. All the words that came to Esther's mind were too shallow, unable to reach the pain that 𝐶𝐚𝐴 had buried away in order to continue living. She understood that terrible thought, and yet the silence of 𝐶𝐚𝐴's pain was too agonizing for her to stand any longer. It's not your fault, 𝐶𝐚𝐴. You can't blame yourself for his illness. It had nothing to do with you. When Esther blurted out her first instinctive response, 𝐶𝐚𝐴 showed no reaction. 𝐶𝐚𝐴, you were only a child. I know you never meant to hurt Isaiah. Please don't blame yourself. You didn't do anything wrong. Again, her words were met with only a numb silence. She couldn't tell if 𝐶𝐚𝐴 even heard her or was ignoring her, or if she was making the other girl feel worse by even saying anything. And yet, despite herself, Esther couldn't bite back the question tugging at her mind. The reason why 𝐶𝐚𝐴 felt so guilty, she had to find a way to understand it, somehow. The argument you had with your father, can I ask what it was about? Finally, her words triggered a response. 𝐶𝐚𝐴's eyes suddenly refocused on her face, holding a strange mixture of fright and revulsion. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. I really don't want to talk about it after all. Swiftly turning away from Esther, she shook her head vehemently. It was impossible not to feel stung by the rejection, even though she knew she had stepped too far. The reflective atmosphere grew tense and uncomfortable again, each second grating by like a loud, discordant note. Esther, is it all right if I have some time alone? When 𝐶𝐚𝐴 quietly spoke again, Esther's body abruptly froze up. It was like an icy knife had just driven inside her chest, carving straight through her heart. The back of her eyes started to burn, and a lump formed at the back of her throat. With a deep breath, Esther managed to numb herself to the reaction. Are we gonna leave her alone by the mausoleum? Wordlessly, she rose to her feet. Unlike her earlier desire to stay close to 𝐏𝐚𝐜, she now felt the urgent need to put distance between them. Without giving Esther another glance, the smaller girl buried her face against her arms. It was clear that trying to speak with her would achieve nothing. There was an almost tangible outer shell around 𝐏𝐚𝐜, dividing her from the rest of the world. And on that somber note, we are going to close the page on this evening's story. But we are drawing close to the end now. I just know we are. We have to be. So how will it all go? Join me next time to find out. So stay safe, take care of yourself, and please, return here whenever you wish. This is Night Novel, signing off.